I wish I could spin a grand poetic tale about discovering my wife's betrayal, but the reality is far less glamorous. It all unfolded like a tired cliché from a badly penned novel. I work at an auto parts factory, specializing in brake production. It's not the most exciting job, but it pays the bills, and I consider myself lucky to have steady work. My days consist of 8 hours on the clock, from 4 in the afternoon to midnight, 5 days a week, operating an old, clunky machine. I'm fully equipped with safety gear, glasses, earplugs, steel-toed boots, and a denim apron. I meet my daily production goals and if I'm fortunate, might get a year-end bonus. My life is pretty settled. A cozy 3-bedroom house, a beautiful wife, and 2 young sons in elementary school. After 12 years of marriage, everything seems stable, until today. We have 5 stations for assembling brake shoes, all powered by compressed air. In the 8 years I've worked here, we've never had a problem with the equipment. But today, halfway through my shift, the compressed air system broke down. The air must be completely dry to work properly, filtered and dehydrated by automatic equipment. But today, the dehydrator failed and didn't expel the collected moisture. I'm no expert, but I know that when moisture mixes with high-pressure air, it causes everything to freeze up and work stops. Instead of waiting around, they sent us home without pay, which is frustrating. It's ironic, my whole day ruined by humidity. When I got home, I walked into the bedroom and saw a hairy back on top of my wife, Laura. I flipped on the overhead light and realized Laura wasn't asleep. She looked irritated, asking why I was there. I expected fear or regret from her, but she was just angry. When I asked why she was so upset, she accused me of already knowing what was happening. She said she regretted that I had to see it, but blamed me for not coming home on time. According to her, if I had been punctual, the other guy wouldn't have been there, and she wouldn't have been caught. The guy, who had been hidden by the bed, now turned to look at me with a smirk. Laura pulled the covers up awkwardly. I made the mistake of grabbing him as he got out of bed. He seemed much bigger standing up than when he was lying down. For my trouble, I got 2 hard punches to the ribs. I couldn't get a single hit in. Before I knew it, I was on the floor, gasping for air. I think I was struck on the side of my head, and that's the last thing I remember. I woke up in the hospital emergency room, a technician bandaging my ribs. Laura was sitting nearby looking disgusted. Once the technician finished and left, I asked Laura who the guy was and why he was in our house. His name's Vincent, she said. He's a friend. I invited him over. You were with him in our bed? Our kids were just down the hall. Yes, I know. If you hadn't made such a scene, they wouldn't have woken up. I had to call my sister to watch them so I could bring you here. What was he doing here? How many times do I have to answer that? Vincent and I have been seeing each other for about 6 months. We tried to keep it from you. We don't usually come here, but I couldn't find a sitter. Is it over now? No, it's not. Ethan, you're a good dad and husband. But Vincent's incredible in bed. I don't see why we should end things just because you found out. But I promise we won't meet here anymore. It's not fair to you or the kids. I'm sorry, Laura, but this isn't okay. It ends now. Ethan, if you try to interfere with my relationship with Vincent, you'll regret it. He'll beat you easily, and he'll do it again. If you do anything, everyone will know you're a loser. Our friends, family, even your co-workers. Your life will be a nightmare. Don't you care what anyone thinks? You'd stoop so low just to hurt me. If I have to, but I doubt you'll risk it. Vincent thinks you're a loser, and I agree. You'll have to live with that, Ethan boy. Who is he anyway? Where does he work? He doesn't work. He owns Continental Classics, the luxury car dealership on Lancaster Pike, the one you always wanted to visit but never did. He's richer, smarter, and better in bed than you. He's also stronger and more skilled with his fists. If he's so great, why not marry him? That's why I keep you, darling. Vincent doesn't want kids, and I'm not giving mine up. You'll play house while he gets the love. You either accept it or everyone will know what a loser you are. And by the way, I'm moving your stuff to the guest room. No need to share a bed now that it's out in the open. Who watched the kids while you were with Vincent? Usually Lisa, sometimes your parents. Speaking of which, Lisa introduced me to Vincent. I'll thank her later. The next morning, they discharged me from the hospital. Laura wasn't around. I considered calling someone or taking a taxi. The taxi won out. With the kids at school and Laura gone, All my clothes and personal belongings were piled on the guest bed. I expected Alex and Sam might ask questions, but I decided to let Laura handle that. It took me less than an hour to set up my new space. My mind was racing with thoughts, but I wasn't going to let things go as Laura planned. My first move was to dig out my old phone recorder from the basement. Even though it only worked with the landline, it was my only option since Laura mostly used her cell phone for calls. Setting up the recorder and hiding it behind some old paint cans took me about 20 minutes. It was a start, at least. Despite feeling terrible, I managed to drag myself back to work. They offered me pain pills, but I hesitated to take them and then operate machinery. Instead, I opted for a couple of heavy-duty Tylenols, figuring that was the safer choice. Laura had seriously underestimated how close I was with my coworkers. I filled them in on everything that happened the previous evening, and they rallied around me, brainstorming ideas, some better than others. It was reassuring to know I had their support. With a full 8-hour shift ahead, we all set to work figuring out how to make things right. During our mid-shift supper break, Marcus spoke up first. "Got any ideas?" he asked. "I don't have one myself, but my cousin works for Romano. He does vehicle detailing and hates Vincent. He might be able to give us some useful intel about the business buildings or work schedules." "That could be useful, Marcus. Anyone else? Ethan?" Dennis chimed in, offering, "I've got 2 muskets and 2 pistols. You're welcome to any of them. None are registered, so there's no worry there." "Thanks, Dennis, but that's a bit more extreme than what I had in mind," I said. "Don't you want to hear my idea?" Charlie interjected with a chuckle. "Sure, Charlie, let's hear it," the group urged. "I was thinking we could tie him to a tree, spread his legs, and build a bonfire Indian style between his legs," Charlie suggested. While Charlie's idea was met with amusement, it was quickly dismissed. Randy, who had been quiet, finally spoke up as everyone looked his way during lunch. "What? Don't give me that look. I have an idea, but it's a bit out there." "Go on, Randy," they encouraged. "I read about a prison in Arizona where they dress offending inmates in pink jumpsuits to humiliate them. Vincent isn't an offender, but something like that could embarrass him. I was thinking if we could capture him, tie him up, and spray paint him entirely pink, that might do the trick. But he'd know who did it. So, we'd have to knock him out first and then leave him tied up until someone finds him." "Do we use medication or just punch him?" someone asked. "I can get some aerosol. All you have to do is sneak up and shock him," Randy suggested. "You're making it sound easier than it probably is. How do we catch him alone? And how do we approach him without being noticed?" "I don't have all the answers. Just thought it was an idea," Randy shrugged. The buzzer signaled that it was time for another 4 hours on the machines. My production numbers were down, so the guys pitched in to help out. When I got home, Laura was already in bed, keeping her promise not to bring Vincent over. I was at a loss for what to do. Most of the ideas we'd come up with felt like high school pranks. Might as well leave a flaming bag of dog poop on his doorstep. I needed something more substantial for revenge. At noon, I got up. With the kids at school and Laura bustling around, I took a shower, shaved, and headed out. "Morning, husband. No kiss?" she said with a smirk by the sink. I ignored her and left. Her comment didn't deserve a response. I needed lunch and some time alone. The afternoon was spent killing time, trying to figure out how to exact my revenge on Laura's lover without causing too much trouble. Work awaited, and I needed to be prepared. I decided to stop eating at home. It was the only time I had with the boys, but I couldn't stomach Laura's cooking. Before I knew it, it was time to head to work. Everything seemed normal until supper break, when Lewis proudly announced that he had a taser in his car for self-defense. He reminded me not to forget to pick it up and asked if I'd ever used it. I admitted I hadn't, but we could give it a try, which elicited groans from the others at the table. Despite the lack of fresh ideas, everyone showed support for me, which was comforting. At home, the routine was ordinary, though working the graveyard shift had messed up my sleep patterns. Alex and Sam, up earlier than usual, suggested going to Chuck E. Cheese. Laura didn't mind since they'd be out all day. Laura also mentioned that I'd need to take a few vacation days as Vincent's friend Frank would be visiting from Detroit next week. They planned to go on a cruise to Cancun. She suggested if I couldn't take the time off, I should ask my parents. I was skeptical about Laura's plans. Going on a sea cruise with 2 guys? Really? "It's not as suspicious as you think," she defended. "Frank will be sharing a room with Lisa, who's been friends with him for years." "Oh, that sounds just great," I replied sarcastically, mentally noting to thank Lisa later. Despite being up early, the day felt like it would drag on. To pass the time before Chuck E. Cheese opened, we visited the nearby Hobby Lobby. The boys, old enough to assemble most of the plastic models, had a blast, even if the results weren't impressive. I let them explore while I checked out the craft supplies. If Laura had been into crafts, maybe she wouldn't have brought home that hairy gorilla, but it was too late now. I was excited to find rows of designer paint and spray cans. There were 6 beautiful pink cans. They didn't hold as much as the ones at Lowe's or Home Depot, but they were pink. It was the only place I'd seen that color in a spray can, so I took it as a sign and bought all 6. Alex picked a monster truck kit, and Sam chose a tugboat. Plastic tugboat models were new to me. Before leaving, I grabbed a pack of 10 large plastic cable ties, each about 18 inches long. They looked sturdy enough for what I had planned. By then, Chuck E. Cheese was ready, and the kids spent a good 4 hours there, indulging in 2 pizzas before finally wearing themselves out. We then went to the park, feeding ducks with some stale bread, and ended the day at my parents' house. They were thrilled to have us for dinner in the evening. Alex and Sam watched TV while I filled Dad in on what had happened with Laura. I realized I was getting the word out before Laura could spin her side of the story. Her threats seemed less intimidating now. Dad promised to look after the boys, which was a relief. Around 9 o'clock, I called Laura to inform her we'd be staying at my parents' house. "Got the machine," she said, which only added to my sense of disbelief. After a hearty breakfast at IHOP the next morning, we returned home to find Laura still in bed. I started working on the lawn while the boys tinkered with their models. Even though the weather was perfect, I kept them indoors. I decided to take my time with the yard work, including edging and pruning. The task took longer than usual because I found myself chatting frequently. I borrowed hedge clippers from James Nolan across the street. His wife, Helen, was known for her love of gossip. I warned James about any unfamiliar cars at our house, telling him Laura might entertain male friends. If they got rowdy, he should call the police. It was tough managing everything since I worked nights. Robert Evans from the local church board lent me a spark plug wrench. I apologized for Laura's recent behavior, which piqued his curiosity. Robert was a bigger gossip than Helen Nolan, and within 10 minutes, he had enough material to last a month. I skipped lunch and finished the lawn work around 4 in the afternoon. After a quick shower, I treated myself to the most expensive dish at Rosie's Cantina. I'm still not sure what it was, but it was delicious. I spent the evening with my brother Jack and his family. Dad had already filled him in on the situation, and I crashed on his couch for the night. Laura had concocted a grand scheme to force me into compliance by threatening to expose me as the betrayed husband. If I didn't play along with her infidelity, she'd make my life a nightmare. It was an interesting plan, but it had many flaws. Within a week, I had already shared the details with everyone, effectively nullifying her threat. I also managed to paint her as a cheap tramp more effectively than she could have imagined. I don't think she anticipated any real fallout. The next afternoon, when I stopped by the house to change for work, Laura was waiting for me, visibly upset. She said that Lisa had told her about rumors spreading among the neighbors that she was running a brothel at night. I reassured her that I had merely mentioned she might have male visitors while I was at work and advised the neighbors not to worry. Laura insisted that the rumors were evolving differently and demanded to know who else I had spoken to. I admitted that I had told everyone, thinking it would be easier. I hadn't mentioned anything to her parents or sisters, so I suggested she handle that before they heard the rumors from someone else. Laura was frustrated, feeling the rumors were making her look bad. I pointed out that the situation wasn't exactly fair to me either, as it made me look like a betrayed husband. She apologized but said she had to leave for work. She mentioned she'd spent some time with the boys before leaving, though it wasn't the quality time she had hoped for. That night, Marcus had some great news. Continental Classics closed at 9 o'clock on Thursdays, so Vincent could handle all the payroll personally. He hated being interrupted during this time, so even the cleaning crew was gone. Randy took a few minutes to show me how to use the taser. No one volunteered to test it. The plan was starting to take shape. If I got caught, which I fully anticipated, I'd likely face jail time. I didn't care. Vincent Romano needed to be humiliated. If I ended up arrested, I'd make sure all the newspapers and TV stations got the full story. Any attention like that would either ruin him or, at the very least, enrage him enough to make a mistake. For the next few days, I only went home to sleep, shower, and change clothes. I hadn't had a meal at home since that first day. Finally, Thursday arrived. I arranged for my truck to have a dead battery, so Randy picked me up. The floor supervisor rarely checked on us brake guys. As long as we met our quotas and maintained quality, they left us alone. The OSHA regulations for the job worked in my favor. With our apron gloves and welding goggles, we all looked pretty much the same. At 8:30, I slipped out the back door. The guys would cover for me at my station. One of their posts would be empty, but no one really cared. Toilet breaks were normal and unregulated. The key was to create the illusion that I never left. I entered the staff entrance at Continental Classics and headed straight to the restroom. Around 9 o'clock, someone quickly checked the area before turning off the lights. 10 minutes later, I put on latex gloves and emerged from the restroom into a dimly lit office area. Vincent's desk was situated with a view of the showroom, so his back was turned to the door. It seemed easier than I had expected. Despite having a computer right in front of him, Vincent was absorbed in an old adding machine with paper tape. He didn't notice me sneaking up. I pressed the taser against the back of his neck, and his body jolted upright. Fearing he might turn around, I quickly administered another shock. This time he twitched slightly before going limp. Perfect. I swiftly secured 2 plastic cable ties around each of his limbs and used an old necktie as a blindfold. Vincent offered no resistance. I rolled his chair over to face the showroom window, ensuring he'd be visible to his staff when they arrived in the morning. The pink paint required more coats than I anticipated. It soaked into his clothing quickly, so I had to apply at least 3 coats to each area for full coverage. I barely had enough paint to finish the job. Vincent looked striking in pink. Once I completed the task, I packed up my supplies carefully. I had expected Vincent to wake up during the process, but he remained motionless. I had planned to remove the necktie blindfold before leaving, but he stayed still even when I checked my watch several times. I grew concerned. I attempted to check his pulse but felt nothing, even after removing a latex glove to improve my sensitivity. His pulse was undetectable, and his eye didn't react when I touched it with a pencil tip. Panic started to set in. I took a deep breath, regained my composure, and put the latex glove back on. I wiped down everything I might have touched and pocketed the necktie. I cut off the plastic ties, revealing marks from the pink paint, giving him a peculiar appearance, a pink raccoon. After making sure I hadn't missed anything, I left for work. On my way back, I disposed of all the items, including the taser, in a storm sewer. Back at the shop, I resumed working on brake shoes. No one noticed my brief absence. After the shift, I updated the guys on what had transpired. They were all in on it, so I was confident no one would spill the beans. Charlie seemed impressed, and the others didn't seem concerned. Randy drove me home, and we noted the time of his drop-off. I didn't manage to sleep as long as usual. Around 10 o'clock, Laura stormed into my room. "What did you do? What did you do, you idiot?" She was furious. I just rolled over, pretending not to understand. "What are you talking about?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "Vincent's dead. Lisa called and said they found him in his office this morning. Dead. I suspect you had something to do with it. And I'll make sure you pay, you idiot." It was the second time she had called me an idiot in minutes. It was clear I wouldn't be getting any more sleep, so I stumbled out of bed and headed to the bathroom. Not eager to face Laura's wrath, I took a long, hot shower and shaved slowly. I even dabbed on some aftershave just to annoy her. I never made it to the coffee pot. A tall man stood in the living room talking to Laura. He had closely cropped hair and wore a dark suit. It was clear she had called the police. I shook my head and went into the kitchen for my first cup of the day. Laura wore a smug smirk as I settled into my favorite recliner. The uninvited guest followed me. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Detective Malcolm Rivers," he said. "I'm here about the death of Anthony Romano last night. Your wife mentioned that you and Mr. Romano had a disagreement last week. I'd like to ask you a few questions." "Sure, no objections, but not here," I replied. "If you want to talk, let's do it in your office, not in my home." "Is that okay with you?" Detective Rivers asked. I noticed Laura's frown deepen. She clearly expected to be part of the conversation. Your car or mine? I asked. I have a few things to attend to, so I'll meet you there. Any particular offices? He asked. Second floor, rear room 206. Just turn right when you get off the elevator. I'll see you shortly, he said. Laura was fuming as I put on my shoes. I didn't finish the coffee, so I dumped it in the sink. I turned and smiled as I walked out the door. I guess you'll get what you wanted, sweetheart. What are you talking about? What do you mean, Ethan? 10 minutes later, I was seated with Detective Rivers on the second floor of the municipal building. For the next hour, he asked all the pertinent questions, and I provided suitable answers. He carefully broached the topic of the affair without being too direct. Naturally, I acknowledged having a motive, but insisted I never had the chance to act on it. It was a serious matter, but I aimed to be cooperative and straightforward. The most intriguing part of the conversation was learning that Vincent had passed away due to a heart issue. He had a pacemaker, which apparently didn't react well to the taser. They figured out the taser's involvement from the marks on his neck. I felt a pang of remorse about Vincent's death, but there was also a sense of relief. Detective Rivers gave me the usual "don't leave town" spiel and mentioned he'd be in touch after verifying my alibi. It was a surprise. I never imagined I'd need an alibi for anything. The notion was strangely exhilarating. We parted on amicable terms, and I felt a bit of comfort knowing Detective Rivers seemed supportive. After grabbing a quick bite, I turned on the TV. There was a segment about the death of a local businessman, Vincent Romano, noting that he had no relatives in the area. I withdrew funds from our bank accounts and treated myself to a nice breakfast. There were tasks to tackle at home, and Laura wasn't around when I got back. I spent half an hour moving my belongings to the master bedroom and her things to the guest room. With limited storage in the guest room, I piled her things on the bed for her to sort. I checked the telephone recorder in the basement, but found nothing noteworthy. I gathered banking, insurance records, and other important documents. Fortunately, Laura's Volvo was in my name, simplifying things. I tucked everything into a folder under the front seat of my truck. I then called work and requested a 2-week vacation. A few hours later, Laura arrived home and seemed surprised to find me there. It was time to reassert myself. I grinned as I led her to the guest room. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice edged with irritation. "You'll be using the guest room from now on. I'm taking the master bedroom. Start putting away your clothes. Anything left out by dinner will be disposed of." "What do you mean disposed of? I can't fit my stuff in that tiny closet. I won't stay in that room anyway." "If it doesn't fit in the closet or dresser, you don't need it. This is non-negotiable. Ethan, you're in trouble. Get your act together." That was the third time she called me an idiot that day. It seemed I was making progress. While Laura busied herself with the guest room, I emptied her purse on the kitchen table. I carefully took what I wanted: her cell phone, car keys, driver's license, credit cards, debit cards, and cash, leaving the rest behind. I retrieved the car title from my pickup and drove Laura's Volvo to a friend's car lot across town. I sold it to him at a fair price with the understanding that he'd sell it wholesale out of town. Even after settling the loan, I pocketed a few $1,000s. As I entered Taco Bell for lunch, my cell phone rang. "You witch! Where's my cell phone and where's my car?" Laura's angry voice came through. I was relieved she didn't use her usual mocking tone. She was calling from the house phone. It was a good test. I'd review the recorder later. "I'm sorry, honey. I needed money to hire a lawyer for the homicide charges. I promise I'll get you another car once I'm out of jail," I said, ending the call and turning off the cell phone. That conversation underscored the importance of getting a lawyer. No matter what happened, I was determined to end my marriage, but I had to wait. I was next in line to order. When I got home, Alex and Sam were there. I went straight to them, ignoring Laura. I glanced her way a few times and noticed her displeasure. The boys eagerly showed me their models. As Laura began preparing dinner, I wandered to the guest room. My clothes were now on the bed, while Laura's were in the master bedroom. I chuckled, but decided against arguing. She seemed stubborn and determined. Laura instructed the boys to wash up for dinner, and I returned to the guest room to unpack. I would have liked to discard her belongings, but it seemed too petty. I treated myself to Red Lobster that night. Money wasn't an issue. I still had cash left after the lawyer's deposit. The shrimp and lobster combo was delicious, though the cheese rolls remained my favorite. After finishing dinner, I turned on my cell phone, hoping for a call from work or Detective Rivers. The first call I received was from Laura, who asked how she could get to the grocery store for some items, including milk. I told her I'd take her when I returned, and suggested planning our shopping trips for Saturdays when I was off work. I mentioned I preferred she not go alone, and ended the call, noting another call coming in. The second call was from Randy. He informed me that Detective Rivers had interviewed everyone individually and as a group. Everyone's alibis checked out. He mentioned that John Andrews, the floor manager, had strongly supported him, emphasizing that Randy couldn't have missed work. When I arrived home just in time to tuck the boys in, I found Laura sitting on the couch with a glass of wine. I grabbed a cold Foster's and settled into my recliner, hoping to start a conversation. I asked her about her plan to paint me as a villain, but she quickly ended the conversation and went to her bedroom. It became clear she wasn't interested in talking. Disappointed, I grabbed my beer and checked the recorder. The first call was to Laura's sister Marge, who knew about the affair with Vincent and supported Laura. That was reassuring. The next call was to Laura's mother, who was unaware of the details. Laura had convinced her that Vincent was a friend of Lisa's and that I was jealous because I'd been pursuing Lisa for years. While she didn't directly accuse me of the homicide, it was strongly implied. She had contacted the cell phone company to inquire about a replacement for the phone I took, but had no luck. Then Laura contacted the DMV to report her lost driver's license, and they advised her to inform the police. When she called the bank to request a new credit card, she discovered the account had been closed. I had to give her credit. She was persistent. The final call on the recorder was to Lisa. Despite living nearby, they opted for a phone conversation rather than meeting in person. This worked in my favor. From their conversation, I picked up two crucial details. Frank was still coming from Detroit, and Laura planned to lay low until his arrival. The next morning, the boys and I were out of the house early, before Laura woke up. We came back home after lunch, and Laura insisted I drive her to the grocery store since she had no car or driver's license. That evening, while she was busy preparing dinner, I checked the recorder. Frank had arrived and immediately called Laura. Their conversation was revealing. He believed Laura's story and vowed to seek revenge. Frank and Vincent were childhood friends, and Frank was adamant about getting justice. He gave Laura his contact information and told her to call him the following day. Laura then excitedly phoned Lisa, expressing her joy. It was astonishing to see this sudden, complete transformation in her. I never thought my actions would provoke such a drastic change in her behavior. Before heading to bed, I grabbed a burger. Since the lawn needed mowing again, I used it as an excuse to avoid Laura the next day. Around 11 o'clock, Laura's parents arrived to take the boys for an unplanned sleepover. I didn't object. Grandma Wilcox assured me they'd be back in time for school. I postponed checking the phone recorder until after lunch, having skipped breakfast. After a quick shower, I went to Denny's. Laura didn't mention my absence, and she and Frank had concocted a plan for avenging Vincent's death. Their plan struck me as somewhat absurd given what I knew. It involved Frank entering the house through the back deck's sliding door, while Laura assured him it would be unlocked if everything went as planned. It was supposed to look like a burglary gone wrong, with me getting shot. Both Laura and Lisa were to call emergency services upon hearing the gunshot. It dawned on me that I hadn't updated my insurance policy beneficiaries. As I left, I gave Laura a sarcastic kiss goodbye, which earned me a rude gesture in return. I had dinner with my parents and stayed the night. Before leaving, I borrowed Dad's snake charmer, a short-barreled 20-gauge, for the upcoming event. When I returned home, Laura was in bed with her light on, presumably reading. The only message on the answering machine was from Lisa, boasting about the enjoyable afternoon she and Frank had. She assured Laura of her readiness for later that night. I spent about 20 minutes swapping out the buckshot and the shells for rock salt, using a leftover bag from last winter. My goal wasn't to kill Frank, but merely to slow him down. Honestly, I didn't wish harm on Vincent either. I hoped Frank didn't have a bad heart like Vincent did. I wanted to check the back deck door, but hesitated, fearing Frank might spot me. I had to assume Laura had left it unlocked. I stripped down to my shorts and messed up the bed blankets. A cup of coffee would have been nice, but I settled for a drink, waiting in my recliner with the cell phone close by. Frank didn't arrive until after midnight. When I spotted him on the deck, I promptly dialed emergency services, reporting an intruder in my house and expressing fear for my life, keeping the line open. The patio door slid open quietly, and Frank stepped inside. I waited until he was fully inside before taking the first shot, aiming for his lower body to avoid killing him. The blast knocked him back under the deck. With the second shot, he tumbled over the deck's side, breaking the railing. I knew I hadn't eliminated him, as he howled in pain. The rock salt must have stung something fierce. The musket blast indoors was deafening, and my ears were ringing. When I turned on the lights, Laura was already in the living room, screaming. Although she was shouting at me, I couldn't make out her words. I approached Frank and noticed a Ruger .22 automatic pistol with a silencer on the floor. Laura continued to scream, so I aimed the musket at her, causing her to quickly quiet down and flee the room. It seemed Frank had broken his ankle in the fall. Some guys have all the luck. 10 minutes later, the first police car arrived. There was little discussion. I placed the musket on the floor to avoid any confusion. Pointing to the phone, I told the officers everything was under control. When they asked about other occupants, I mentioned Laura in the bedroom. When they brought her into the living room, they realized their mistake. Despite their best efforts, Laura and I were both unsuccessful in calming the situation. Eventually, a large female officer gently escorted Laura outside. I saw Lisa standing with some neighbors and gave her a smirk along with a gesture across my throat. Lisa quickly turned away, ignoring me. The EMTs arrived for Frank just as Detective Rivers showed up. He greeted me with a knowing smile, which I couldn't resist returning. It wasn't meant to be cheeky, but I couldn't help it. The female officer then brought Laura back inside to get dressed. After she was ready, we all headed to the police headquarters. I requested to ride separately, and Detective Rivers agreed to let me accompany him. The drive downtown was quiet, but he managed to throw me a smile every now and then. By daylight, Rivers released me. Despite a brief chat of about 30 minutes, they had kept me at the station all night, serving me coffee to keep me awake. A police car drove me home, and I was let down to find no yellow tape around the house. Everything seemed to be in order, and even the rock salt had left no damage. Frank had taken the worst of it. I estimated it would take me about an hour to fix the broken railing. I went to bed and slept soundly until after lunch. When I emerged from the bedroom, I was surprised to find Detective Rivers sitting at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper and sipping coffee. Apparently, he had made himself quite at home while I slept. I grabbed a tall glass of orange juice and sat across from him. How he had gotten into the house was beyond me. "You've got a cool demeanor, Mr. Thompson," Rivers commented, still absorbed in his paper. I wasn't sure if he was teasing or serious, so I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. Finishing his coffee, he finally said, "Detective Rivers, I need a shower, a shave, and some lunch. I'll treat if that's allowed." "Take your time, Ethan. I've got all day," he replied, smiling. I headed for the shower, wondering how he managed to stay so calm. Lunch was a hearty affair, with 2 pulled pork sandwiches, and Rivers joined me in washing them down with a couple of beers. As we relaxed, he broke the silence. "I bet you had a ton of questions for me," Rivers said. "Funny you should mention that." "I was thinking the same about you," I replied. Rivers signaled the waiter for 2 more drafts. "I grilled you all night, now it's your turn." "All right, first things first. Where's my wife?" I asked. "She's still in custody. They're filing charges this afternoon," Rivers responded. The news was surprising, but I had too many questions brewing to dive deeper. I decided to hold back and said, "It's good to see Laura's folks sticking up for her. I won't be joining them." "Any more questions?" Rivers asked, his tone suggesting I might be done for now. He chuckled and took a swig. "One last thing. Did you overhear or record any conversations between your wife and Mr. Williams?" "You mean Frank?" I asked, earning a smirk. "If I had a recording, would you want it?" I replied. Rivers raised an eyebrow. "If things unfold the way I think they might, it might not matter. But if they get skilled lawyers, having evidence could be a problem, right?" "You're right about that. I'm just trying to keep things straightforward. I'll manage without any hypothetical tapes." I nodded in agreement. "Thanks, Ethan. I think it's time for you to drive me home. The boys will be home from school soon, and they'll need their dad." We arrived just as Alex and Sam were getting off the school bus. They approached us eagerly, and I introduced them to Detective Rivers. They were excited to see his badge, but their enthusiasm waned when Rivers asked, "So who built the tugboat and who assembled the monster truck?" I built the truck, Alex declared with pride, while Sam chimed in, I did the tugboat. Want to see it? With a promise of checking them out another time, Sam left with a satisfied grin. I was taken aback, realizing he knew about the pink paint issue and had the upper hand. We ordered pizza for dinner, and the boys didn't ask about their mom. After dinner, Laura's dad called, asking for help with bail money for her release. I politely declined, questioning if he truly grasped the situation, but at least he tried. He mentioned Laura would stay with them. We helped load Laura's belongings into the pickup and dropped them off without a hitch. When I got home, I noticed a U-Haul truck in Lisa's driveway, which was gone by the next morning. Laura never reached out, leaving me to piece together the events from the daily newspaper. I felt deliberately left out. There was no trial. Laura blamed everything on Frank, who countered it was her plan. Both took plea deals. Laura received 5 years for conspiracy to commit homicide, and Frank got 10 years for attempted homicide. Federal authorities were considering Frank's silencer, but postponed action until he completed his sentence. Detective Rivers stopped mentioning the tape, and Lisa vanished without a trace. My dad reclaimed his musket, joking that I might need it again. He also mentioned that Laura had served me with divorce papers. Once her sentence began, she didn't contest the divorce. I hadn't seen or heard from her since the night I shot Frank. I sold the house and moved back in with my parents. Juggling work and looking after the boys on my own was too much. My colleagues welcomed me back warmly, and though they offered me a shift change todays, I declined. I made a point of taking the boys to visit their mother at Muncie Women's Prison regularly. During these visits, I stayed in the car, sometimes waiting outdoors if the weather was good, keeping an eye on them through the chain-link fence. I avoided discussing the visits with them and asked them not to share any details with anyone. This routine worked well for us and life seemed to be returning to normal until the phone call came. Hello, is this Ethan Thompson? Yes, I replied. I'm Sophie Hawkes. Detective Malcolm Rivers suggested I reach out to you. There are some matters we need to discuss. My heart sank. I'm aware of the situation, but why do you want to talk to me? Vincent Romano was my brother. I felt a wave of frustration. Just when I thought I'd moved on from the chaos, this happened. I understand, but I don't think avoiding this conversation is wise. I'm sorry for your loss, but I can't assist you, I said, and hung up before she could say more. 2 days later, Sophie called again. Ethan, I'd really appreciate it if we could meet. There are some things I need to discuss. Detective Rivers mentioned you're reasonable. Where would you like to meet? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. I'd prefer the auto showroom, but I'm open to any location that suits you, she responded. After a brief pause, I agreed. Let's meet Saturday at 10 o'clock at the showroom. I'll bring my sons. They enjoy old cars. I felt uneasy about meeting Sophie, but I figured a public place with the boys would be safer. I didn't want to use them as a shield, but I hoped their presence might discourage any trouble. I speculated about her potential motives, wondering if she might be fiercely determined and emotional given her Italian background. Eventually, I decided I was overthinking it and could use a drink to calm my nerves. I called Detective Rivers for some advice. He chuckled and advised me to meet with Sophie and stop worrying. Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one who had been involved in her brother's death. Continental Classics, the auto showroom, was an impressive establishment. In addition to the main showroom, they had 2 large buildings in the back, filled with cars waiting to be restored or displayed. When we arrived, we were surprised to find they were hosting a grand opening event. It wasn't something I had anticipated. The event was chaotic. The boys were torn between admiring the cars and grabbing the free snacks. There was a strong smell of popcorn in the air. A man in clown attire, complete with floppy shoes and a rubber nose, handed out small bags of freshly popped popcorn. Nearby, another clown manned a hot dog cart, and a soda machine stood ready for use. It seemed like the boys wouldn't need lunch that day. Sophie Hawkes was easy to spot. As soon as she made her way toward me, I recognized her immediately. Her Italian heritage was apparent. Dark hair, olive complexion, and a sturdy build. Vincent had been a giant, but his sister was shorter and stockier. As she approached, she was accompanied by a young girl who looked to be around 10, resembling Sophie with lighter hair and a more petite frame. Sophie seemed to be using the same tactic for security as I was, keeping her child close. As she neared, She extended her hand in a friendly gesture. "Ethan Thompson, I presume?" It felt only natural to shake her hand, though it was reminiscent of a scene from an old film. She wore a smile, though she appeared a bit nervous, which helped to ease my own apprehension. I remained silent, waiting for her to continue speaking. It felt as if I were being deliberately kept out of the loop. There was no trial. Laura placed all the blame on Frank, who in turn claimed it was her idea. Both ended up pleading guilty. Laura was sentenced to 5 years for conspiracy to commit homicide, while Frank received 10 years for attempted homicide. The federal authorities looked into Frank's silencer, but decided to postpone further action until his initial sentence was completed. Detective Rivers never revisited the issue of the tape, and Lisa vanished without a trace. My father reclaimed his musket and joked that I might need it again. He also mentioned that Laura had served me with divorce papers. She didn't contest anything once her jail term began, and I hadn't seen or spoken to her since the night I shot Frank. After selling the house, I moved back in with my parents, struggling to balance work and childcare on my own. My coworkers welcomed me back, but I turned down the offer to switch to the day shift. I regularly took the boys to visit their mother at Muncie Women's Prison, staying in the car during their visits and asking them to keep quiet about the details. This routine seemed to be working well until Sophie's call came through. "Hello? Is this Ethan Thompson?" "Yes, I'm Sophie Hawkes. Detective Malcolm Rivers recommended that I reach out to you. There are things we need to discuss," Sophie said over the phone. I responded cautiously. "I understand, but why reach out to me?" Vincent Romano was my brother. My heart sank. Just when I thought the ordeal was over, this happened. "I don't think this is a good idea. I'm sorry for your loss, but I can't help you." I ended the call before she could respond further. 2 days later, Sophie called again. "Ethan, I'd really appreciate if we could meet. There are things I need to discuss. Detective Rivers mentioned you're a reasonable person." "Where would you like to meet?" I asked. "I'd prefer the auto showroom, but I'm flexible if you have another place in mind." I thought for a moment. "Let's meet at the showroom this Saturday at 10 o'clock. I'll bring my sons. They enjoy looking at old cars." I wasn't sure what Sophie's intentions were, but I felt safer in a public setting with my boys around. I wasn't trying to use them as a shield, but hoped their presence might deter any potential trouble. I realized I might be overthinking things. I decided I needed a beer and called Detective Rivers for some advice. He laughed and told me to meet with Sophie and stop worrying. Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one involved in her brother's death. Continental Classics was an impressive establishment, with a main showroom and 2 large buildings in the back for cars awaiting restoration or display. To my surprise, they were hosting a grand opening event. There were a lot of things about the event that puzzled me. Sam and Alex were torn between admiring the cars and grabbing the freebies. The scent of popcorn filled the air, with a clown in floppy shoes and a rubber nose handing out small bags of hot kernels. Nearby, another clown manned a hot dog cart, and a soda machine stood ready for use. It was clear that the boys wouldn't need lunch that day. Sophie Hawkes was easy to spot. As soon as she approached with a determined stride, I recognized her. Her Italian heritage was unmistakable: dark hair, dark eyes, olive complexion, and broad hips. Vincent had been a giant, but Sophie was shorter and stockier. I felt a bit uneasy as she came closer, but my apprehension eased when I noticed a young girl, about 10 years old, who looked very much like Sophie, but with lighter hair and a more delicate build. It seemed we both used our children for a sense of security. As Sophie approached, she extended her hand with a friendly gesture. "Ethan Thompson, I presume?" I shook her hand, feeling a sense of familiarity, almost as if I were in a scene from an old film. Despite her smile, she seemed slightly nervous, which helped to ease my own discomfort. I waited in silence for her to continue. Sophie explained that she wanted both of us to thoroughly learn the business so we could take control, and she emphasized the need for me to assert myself in the meantime. She admitted she was a nice person, which led Vincent and his wife to take advantage of her. Her tone relaxed as she spoke about Vincent and his wife's failed attempts. I found her comment oddly amusing and couldn't help but chuckle. We spent the next half hour discussing the terms of our arrangement. Sophie offered a better salary and benefits compared to my factory job, with the option to return if things didn't work out, although I hoped they would. Alex wasn't feeling well on the way home, likely from too many hot dogs and sodas. Sam, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy himself, chatting more with Lewis than inspecting the cars, a positive sign. Alex ended up getting sick in the truck and skipped supper. I started work the following Monday, and things unfolded as Sophie had predicted. I quickly familiarized myself with the operation and gained the support of the employees, especially Marcus's cousin, who became my staunchest ally. Most of the staff wanted the business to succeed and reported any misconduct willingly. Sophie delegated firings to me, a task I surprisingly enjoyed. I lived up to my reputation. Detective Rivers frequently visited for coffee, though our conversations remained light. Eventually, he shared a personal story with me. 3 years ago, I was a cop in Philly. I came home one day to find my wife in bed with my supervisor. I lost it and threw them both out. The department gave me an ultimatum: quit or be fired. I ended up finding work here a week later. Before I left, I made sure my wife's lover lost his job too. I didn't press for more details, but at least now I understood why he seemed to favor my side. The boys agreed to keep my new job a secret from their mother. During their visits, they mentioned the long drive, but understood it was necessary. I believed it was important for Laura to see her sons, not for her benefit, but to inflict some emotional pain. I know it was a terrible way to involve the kids, but I found a twisted satisfaction in it. Sophie and I started spending more time together, both at and after work. One weekend, the boys insisted on taking Sophie and Lewis to Noble's Grove. Given our living arrangements, Sophie and Lewis in a small studio apartment, and me still living with my parents and the boys, romantic prospects were complicated. Despite this, the business was thriving, and Sophie discussed the possibility of buying a house. Sophie spent hours scouring online listings for the perfect home. My first clue that she saw me as more than just an employee came when she mentioned needing a 4-bedroom house for the boys. "Ethan, I think each of the boys should have their own room. It's better to sort this out now rather than later. Don't you agree?" I realized this was more than a casual suggestion. Sophie seemed to view our relationship differently now, and the idea of something romantic between us began to seem plausible. "Yeah, I think that's a great idea. A split bedroom layout would work well too. I wouldn't want them too close to the master bedroom," I said before heading out of the office. Sophie gave me a small, knowing smile, marking the evolution of our relationship. Although we hadn't been intimate or particularly close, I felt a deeper connection with her than I had ever felt with Laura over 12 years. 2 days after finalizing my divorce from Laura, we celebrated at Red Lobster. The kids were oblivious to the real reason behind our celebration, but Sophie was fully aware. Later that night, while the kids were engrossed in a movie at the apartment, Sophie kissed me in the kitchen. We embraced and laughed until Lewis caught us. "Oops, sorry, Mom," Lewis said, grinning. "It's about time." Sophie and I behaved ourselves for the rest of the evening, both of us eager for what was to come. The next day, while the kids were at school, Sophie and I took an extended lunch break and returned to the apartment with an air of unspent energy. We didn't get back to work until just before the end of the day. As time went on, Sophie's focus on finding a new house intensified. Detective Rivers continued to drop by casually, sometimes admiring the cars. He developed a fondness for a Studebaker Hawk that had previously belonged to Robert Langley, and Sophie offered him a good price for it. Out of the blue, Sophie asked me to drive her to visit Laura. Despite our fewer trips to Muncie, Laura didn't seem to mind. When I asked Sophie why she wanted to visit, she simply said, "Closure." Though I understood the term, it felt somewhat abstract to me. I offered to accompany her, but Sophie insisted I just drop her off, saying I didn't need to be there for the conversation. On a warm, sunny fall day, we arrived at Muncie. Since the visits were held outdoors, I parked near the fence. 10 minutes later, I watched as Sophie and Laura met in the exercise yard and sat at a picnic table, chatting and smiling as if they were old friends. However, the scene quickly turned when, after just 5 minutes, Laura's smile vanished. She leaned across the table, her face darkening as she glared at Sophie. Sophie remained calm and upbeat. Suddenly, Laura lunged at Sophie, trying to grab her. The commotion was swiftly controlled by guards who escorted Laura back into the building, where she protested loudly. Sophie looked at me, shrugged, and smiled before leaving the visitors area. She was still grinning when she got back to the car. "What was that about?" I asked. Sophie chuckled. "Your ex is quite touchy. She seemed to take a dislike to me once she thought I was on her side. I might have given her the impression that I was here for revenge. How so? I asked. I told her I was from Baltimore and had a score to settle. She took that to mean I was after you. Is that so? I said, intrigued. Absolutely. What I really meant was that I wanted to get back at Vincent by taking over his business. I suppose you can still get revenge on someone who's already dead, right? I was curious. What made her so upset? She wanted details. When, where, and how. I knew she was asking about you. I told her it would take some time and asked if she wanted updates on my progress. She was eager to know exactly how I planned to do it. When I revealed my strategy, she completely lost it. Her reaction was quite something. Okay, but how do you plan to get rid of me? I asked, genuinely interested. Sophie's grin widened. My plan is to wear you out until you can't take it anymore. That's all. Really? That's it? I laughed. I thought she might get angry, but I didn't expect her reaction to be so intense. We sat there in a brief silence, both of us smiling. I felt a surge of pride for Sophie. When do you plan to start? As soon as we reach the next motel, she said with a playful tone. 2 months later, Sophie and I got married in a simple backyard ceremony at our new house. Sophie sent Laura a wedding invitation along with a note. Everything is proceeding according to plan.